Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining today's HR webinar. Those who don't know me, I'm Tim Kellett from Paydata, and today's Baffled by the Budget webinar is really here to help you with make sense of last Wednesday's budgets from an HR perspective. We've got a host of slides today to get through, and we'll send out those slides at the end of the session today. Just a little bit about who Paydata are. For those who don't know us, we are a reward management consultancy. We work with a wide range of organizations to help them to find, attract, retain and motivate sort of their key skills they need to run their businesses. We have a host of different services that we provide. So one of our key areas is pay benchmarking. We help support organizations in terms of developing a reward strategy. We have our own job grading system. We support the pay review process by providing online software to help that whole process. Very popular at the moment, people looking at pay structure and pay modeling, so creating salary scales and salary ranges. So we support that. Internal pay equity is a key thing, and creating transparent pay structures is part of that, but also looking at equal pay. So we've been doing equal pay audits for 15 years. And then lastly, we support organizations by providing a whole range of research and insights and business insights to help support their internal discussions on anything reward related, pay related as well. And that's what today is all about, is providing you with some hopefully some useful information to support your internal discussions of following last week's budget. I'm delighted that you won't be hearing just my own voice. I've got Steve Herbert here, who joined us for our September reward conference in London. We had some fantastic feedback from Steve, and he's been working in this area and presenting for over 20 years on this sort of information, and he's been working a career spanning over 40 years now. So I'm delighted that we've got Steve here with us, and we've got his time and his thoughts on the budget to hopefully help you sort of pick through all the things that have come through. So thank you very much for joining us, Steve. And
Morning.
good morning. And before sort of Steve delves into things, I thought I'd sort of kick things off with some information from our own surveys and our own research in terms of pay and reward trends. And what I thought I would look at is firstly conduct just a very top level PESTLE analysis. So what sorts of factors affect pay and rewards for organizations? And obviously that first one, political, we've got today is very topical. We've got the US election today. I obviously got globally, lots of challenges on that side. But domestically, we had last week's budget. We've had the recent public sector pay deals, national living wage increase, obviously national insurance rates, what's going on with those. Then we've got the sort of economic data, exchange rates, interest rates, inflation. That has an impact on pay and reward decisions. Sort of the generational attitudes, and that affects, what sort of benefits people want to offer and what sort of take up they have on that. We're talking to a lot of organizations. They look at, they're talking about a digital transformation, so AI and what that means for jobs and for the labor market in general. Then there's the sort of constant changes on the legal side. So we did a webinar earlier this year on the EU Pay Transparency Directive. There's obviously all this sort of legislation coming around to expand the pay gap reporting to ethnicity and disability as well. There's this sort of climate change as well, and how that affects products and customers, and what sort of take up of benefits as well. So all these factors have an impact on pay and rewards. We actually did surveyed this in over sort of September and October as well, and we asked people what's going to have the greatest impact on your forthcoming pay awards, and the results were really interesting. So we asked people to, here's a list of things which could have influenced your pay awards, and what would you rank them in terms of importance and influence basically on your pay award. what's interesting is that, looking at last year's pay budget, that could affect a number of the most highest ranking influences like budget, obviously, the pay market data, economic data, and as well. So I thought I'd start off with just providing some information from our point perspective, from Paydata's perspective, on those top three ones. The other ones, we've got some really useful information, and we probably pick up at another webinar. But I wanted to leave some space, obviously, for Steve to speak as well. So I'm just going to go through those top three influences and how that might affect people's future pay awards. So if you look at budget and affordability, which is rank the most, the largest influence there, one of the areas of that is, if you look at it, it's the national living wage increase over the last few years. And if you look back over the last 6 years, the increase in the national living wage, excluding the most recent announcement for next year, it's actually a 15.5% increase on what we track as our median pay awards. And for some organisations, this creates a real challenge around pay compression, because obviously there's that mandatory increase for the most junior roles, but people obviously have then supervisory roles above them, and they want to maintain a differentiation in terms of the pay, but they may not be able to afford to pay them the sort of increase that the national living wage has been showing as well. So that's created some challenges, and it might continue to provide some challenges going forward, and particularly in terms of if an organisation has a high population of people at that sort of national living wage, the real living wage sort of level, they might have to limit what they're doing in terms of pay budget increases for other groups, perhaps their support staff. And we've seen that the case perhaps in the past, in a few years back, but that might be the case next year when we look to next year as well. And obviously there was the announcement of the latest living wage increases, and got the so you got sort of over almost 7% on the national living wage in terms of the increases. The real living wage for living wage employers, that's gone up by sort of 5% as well. Actually, my colleague Naomi sent me some information and said that there was a poll very recently by Employee Benefits, which asked HR people, do you think the real living wage increase goes far enough to support employees? And actually, I think 68% of employers said we don't think the living wage increase goes far enough. So actually, it's really interesting that that's gone up as despite those increases, that's there's more people think there's more to come, really. So that's going to have an impact in terms of budget and affordability as well. So. Okay, just moving on to the second influence in that ranking, we have external pay market data. That's the next one, and we collect a whole host of information. So we've got almost 200 predicted pay awards for next year. We have over 450 in terms of this year's pay awards. Wide range of sectors covered in our database, and in terms of our salary survey data, we have over 1 million individual job holders in our market database as well. So that gives us a whole host of information around to be able to analyze pay trends and pay budgets and what's going on with them as well. So in terms of this year, if we're looking at the external pay market data, I'm sort of setting aside the sort of the effect, excluding national living wage increases here. But if you're looking at how pay budgets have changed, you can sort of see last July, the most common pay prediction for this year was 5%. And you fast forward to where we are now with our database, and yes, the range is still the same, 4 to 5% pay awards this year, but actually the most common is an even tie between 4 and 5%. So that's only recently the 4% have come up as we've gone through the year. And so obviously, that has an impact, and people seeing that has an impact in terms of their pay awards. Very few pay freezes this year. So that's the story of this year. 4 to 5% is where the bulk of where most people's pay awards have been. Uh, that's the pay award. Then we're very conscious that there's that sort of out of cycle increases, and we track this from year to year as well. You can see that they've decreased since a high in 2022, when most people said to us 2022 was a really, looking at the external market data, looking at the labor market, that was really a high, a lot of people threatening to move jobs, and retention difficult. So that was a challenge then, but it's sort of come down since then. The predictions for next year don't show much of a change from this year in terms of the median out of cycle increase out of that. But it's interesting that anecdotally, people have said that the last couple of years the pay increases have been pretty high. So that's in some ways that's kept in check that out of cycle increase. But going forward, if pay increases next year reduce, will we start to actually see the out of cycle increases go up next year? So that might provide a bit more of an upward influence going forward, out of the main cycle as well. I mentioned next year, so I thought it'd be useful to just give you the latest pay predictions in our database. Basically, for most organisations, it seems to be they're looking at 1% lower than what they did this year. So if they did a 5% pay increase this year, they might be looking at 4% next year, or 4% this year, they might be looking at 3% next year. So it's a bit of an even tie between 3 and 4% at the moment in terms of what the pay budgets are. That's quite a difference from this year, because if you think about this year, there was a lot of pay awards at 4 or 5% this year. Next year, we only have 12% of predictions showing above 4% as a pay increase for next year. So it's really, that's come down for next year. Still very few, small number of organisations predicting a pay freeze. What will be interesting, and there's been a lot of debate about this, okay, post budget, again, going back to affordability, what will organisations be able to afford? And it'll be interesting to see whether these numbers change. We'll be hosting a webinar back end of January time, and collecting some data at the turn of the year to sort of see if those pay awards have changed at all from sort of early autumn predictions. So that's where we're sort of currently looking at in terms of the external pay market data. The third factor was the external economic data I mentioned. And, obviously you can look at it different ways. So you look at inflation, and I've got inflation, sort of the average increase in inflation over the last 5 years. And you can sort of see actually that compared with our median pay awards data over the last 5 years. And there is still a gap there of 3.5%, 3.7% cumulative over the last 5 years. So some organisations have spoken to us and said that there's still an expectation that, when inflation was at 10% at one point, we weren't giving 10% pay awards. So there is an expectation amongst some employees that there's still some catching up to be done in terms of pay budget. So if that's the case for you, that might provide a bit more of an upward pressure going where it has been upward pressure in the last few years. It might continue into next year. Conversely, if you look at the shape of what's happened with inflation, and it's been on a downward curve since sort of the beginning of this year, it's been falling. We're at the sort of 2% mark now. Predictions are it'll be around 2.5%. So actually, with it being at a lower rate, will that provide more, more of a downward force? You look at the pay predictions for next year, and you might say, yes, inflation's not where it was, so that will ease one part of the pressure if you're looking at the economic data. Actually last week, what was interesting, the Office for Budget, consumer consumer price index is 1.7, so it's below 2% at the moment in the latest figures. The OBR actually provided an update on their forecasts for inflation for the next few years, and you can sort of see actually there's quite a lot of stability going forward. It's going to be around the sort of 2 and 2.5% mark. The reforecast, what's interesting is we're taking into account, I think the OBR, taking into account the sort of what's coming out of the budget, predicted perhaps slightly higher inflation over the next couple of years than perhaps it did do in March time, which is the sort of orange figure there. So maybe in the short term, some of the measures that put in place might increase prices in the next couple of years slightly, but it's still going to be fairly stable, certainly a lot more stable than it has been in the last few years. So you might say that that stability might have a sort of impact on people's pay awards. And finally, other economic data is obviously average earnings, and that's been reducing, was increasing over 2022-23, reduced this year, and that might continue to reduce if we're looking at lower pay increases next year as well. So will that continue to fall from its sort of current 4.5% sort of as well? So certainly on the sort of private sector side. So those were the sort of the three areas. I said there were some other factors influencing pay awards, and I might come on to those in the next webinar in January time. That's enough of me for now. I think I'm going to hand over now to Steve, who's going to be talking about the budget and from a sort of economic perspective. So over to you, Steve. Anyway.
Thank you, Tim. I don't put my camera on, folks, because I don't like looking at me, and I'm sure you wouldn't either, frankly. I have a voice for radio, a face for radio. So, baffled by the budget. Well, let's be honest, folks, we're all baffled by the budget, not just this budget, but all budgets. They are intensely complex things to understand, but hopefully I can throw a bit of light on the bits that are relevant to the audience today, so be that reward, payroll, or HR experts. What I would suggest, though, is you don't start, if assuming the click's going to work. There we go, sorry. The wonder of technology. You don't necessarily start with the national newspapers. Over the years, and particularly over the last half a decade, really, the national newspapers have become so political that they're not really giving you any great insights other than whatever they're trying to talk to their particular audience. Nevertheless, it is true that this particular budget is a really, really big one. I mean, genuinely. It's probably the biggest tax take that we've seen in modern times. And just to put this in context, we're now at a situation where the tax take for the revenue for HMRC is at about the same level it was at just after the Second World War. So when the UK was pretty much broken in all practical respects, we're back at that sort of level. It would have been there had we just stuck with the Conservative budget, and actually we're slightly above where we are with the Labour budget. But either way, we're in a situation where the tax take is really, really high. Now, why is that? Well, let's just take a step back because it's important to understand the context here. We've had in my sort of working career 3 big changes of government, 3 changes from one side to the other, if you like. In 1997, we had the Labour government under Tony Blair with a landslide majority taking over from a Conservative government that had been in place for many, many years. What did the Labour government inherit? Well, they inherited an economy in a good shape, growing nicely, but public services that weren't. In 2010, after the financial crisis, we had an economy being picked up by the coalition from the Labour government that was in very poor shape, but public services that were quite healthy and have been well funded over the previous years. And in 2024, after 14 years of one government, we now have a new government coming in, and they're inheriting an economy that's in bad shape and public services that are in a bad shape. So it doesn't take a genius to work out this was always going to be a difficult budget. Regardless of whether the Labour Party won or the Conservatives have won, or indeed anybody else, this was always going to be a difficult reset from where we are. And it is worth pointing out, as I did to the audience in September for Paydata, that actually we're just coming up to the halfway point in the decade, if you like, on the 31st of December. And this decade has been nothing if not miserable, let's be honest. We've had the end of Brexit, we've had a pandemic, we've had the candidate crisis, we've had wars, really nasty wars in both Eastern Europe and now the Middle East. We've had a cost of living and a cost of borrowing crisis, and we've had industrial action in a way we haven't seen since the 1970s, 1980s, and this summer, even civil unrest, which was very, very unpleasant indeed. So you put all that together, of course, we have a difficult backdrop. Now, the black hole that kept being spoken about before the budget was either 22 billion or 40 billion or 10 billion. And you know what? It doesn't really matter. The truth of the matter is there was always going to be a black hole. We've had a change of government. There were some promises being made towards the end that clearly hadn't been properly funded. And that, of course, does immediately tie the hands of the government. But that doesn't mean the government have actually played their cards particularly well here. I was quite struck by this quote from Stephen Bush, who's an editor at the FT, about a week before the budget. And I think he says something very true here, that Labour have successfully landed the argument that they've inherited a mess from the Conservatives. I think that's accepted. But by the same token, they've also convinced people that they don't know how to sort it out. And that's kind of the story that's been going on over the course of the last 4 months until we got to the budget itself. And partially that's because of this rather strange decision to actually delay the budget. So the Labour Party took over on the 4th of July, so early July this year, and they didn't actually call a budget until virtually November this year. So that's 4 months with no direction in terms of the overall policy. Now, my best guess as to why that was, because that is a really long period of time. The last time we had a government come in and not have a budget for 4 months was 1970, which gives you an idea this is unusual. My best take on this was once the Labour Party had accepted that they had a huge problem with the budget, they wanted a bit of cover. And what they were going to get out of having the budget this late, and indeed are getting, is a period when the Tories still hadn't appointed an opposition leader. So that was good for them. But probably more importantly, we've got this week something much more important than anything that's going to happen in the UK just right now, and that is the US election and the result of the US election, which may be this week, but could easily be several weeks away, depending on how tight it is. So they got the cover in terms of if the budget went down badly, perhaps the media will be looking elsewhere. And when I checked on the ITV and the Sky and the BBC News websites really early this morning, they were there. The budget didn't appear on any of those sites on the front page. So kind of the budget, although it is huge and it is a really huge budget, it has kind of already moved off into the ether as far as the media are concerned. But where the Labour Party played that bit rather well, they perhaps didn't play the rest of their cards as well. We had the two-child benefit cap debate back in late July, which actually cost them a few MPs. They said, if you vote against us, this being the government, we will take the whip away from you. And indeed, they did that. So that alienated some of their own base and indeed some of the people that have voted for them. And much more importantly, and rather strangely, to be blunt about it, we had that announcement around the winter fuel allowance in early September, which has cost them an awful lot of political credibility. They've lost many of their own supporters. And right now, the Labour Party should be in their strongest possible position to bring forward a really harsh budget because they've got a landslide majority behind them. They've got 5 years ahead of them. You know, these things should be easy, but they kind of ended up treading on eggshells as they went into the budget. And that's why some of the changes we expected, particularly around pensions, I think have had to be parked so they didn't upset anybody else into the next year. And all of that has had a knock-on effect to how Britain feels, if you like, how business feels, how consumers feel, indeed how Britain feels about the parliament they've just elected. You know, Labour have got a massive majority, but already Keir Starmer has suffered the biggest fall in popularity for a new PM in just that 120, 125 days, whatever it's been, since the election. And that matters because confidence, as I said to you in September, is absolutely key. If you have confidence, you get inward investment. If you have inward investment, you get confidence. And that's really what we need to break the cycle of where we've been over the last few years. Will this budget deliver that? Well, spoilers, no. Not really. If you ask the experts whether this budget is a good one for growth, and that's what the economy needs, the answer seems to be coming back, meh. You know, no one's really sure, but it doesn't look particularly gangbusters and not even significantly better than where we were in March with the Conservative budget. But there's a lot can change there. And we should also bear in mind that economic forecasting is not like weather forecasting. And I think this is a myth that's grown up over the years. The media are particularly guilty of this one. If you go home tonight and you put on the weather and it says tomorrow it is definitely going to be raining, and they show you the satellite forecast showing you the rain clouds coming in, it is definitely going to be raining 100%. Well, tomorrow it will be raining. Now, there's things you can do to mitigate against that. You can put up an umbrella, you can stay in, but it is still going to rain. Economic forecasting isn't like that. It really isn't. The truth of the matter is, just by producing a forecast, it changes the future outcome. So if the OBR produce a forecast and say that next year we'll be in recession, and at the moment they haven't done that happily, but if they did that, then consumers and businesses react in a different way. And the way our behaviors change to that news probably changes the outcome. So economic forecasting is not an exact science. It's a best guess with good methodology, but actually we shouldn't get too hung up on the forecast. And the further you forecast out, the less likely it is to be accurate. So just thinking back to 2019, if you said in 2019, in the next couple of years, we were going to be facing a pandemic, the Ukraine war, and then the war in the Middle East, no one really would have believed you, and no forecast allowed for that. So don't get too high up on forecasting. We just got to deal with what we've got in front of us right now and the short term, if you like. And the last point before I go into the detail, when you're thinking about budgets, which are essentially about the two things that government can do, tax and spending. That's really what any government can do. Think of it as a bit like whack-a-mole, or to borrow from Sir Isaac Newton, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Whatever happens on tax and spending, it has a reaction somewhere else in the economy and somewhere else in the budget. And right now, we're punching down moles, but they're popping back up again. And with such a difficult economic legacy, there are always going to be a lot of moles in our sights, and some of those moles are particularly difficult for us as employers. So, on to the actual detail of where we are, the budget thoughts, if you like. And I'm going to start off with that national insurance rise, because that is the biggie for employers. That is where the cost really is for employers. But it is important just to break that down a bit. This is the recent history of national insurance, and it's been a bit of a roller coaster over the last few years. Now, back in 2022, we had the introduction of the Health and Social Care Levy, short-lived, I think I should add to that phrase, which saw all three categories of national insurance, employer, employee, and employee upper band, all going up significantly to allow for that new levy. And then just a few short months later, we saw all three bands coming down when that levy was removed. So for most of the recent past, national insurance, the various thresholds, they've all moved in lockstep, as it were. Then we got to the end of last year and beginning of this year, and we suddenly had not one, but two reductions to the middle band of employee national insurance. Now, whether that was a sensible thing to do and why it was needed in such a short period of time remains to be argued. But you can suddenly see that this lockstep between the three categories of national insurance changed. And this was a big reduction from 12% to 8% in a very short period of time. And therefore, up pops our little whack-a-mole. The truth of the matter is, when you've got such a big reduction to such a big tax take for the revenue, of course there's going to be a knock-on effect, and of course that mole is going to have to pop up somewhere else. Where has it popped up? Well, sadly for employers, it's popped up on your bottom line. So what was announced last week was an increase from 13.8% employers' national insurance to 15%, a 1.2% gain. Now, that doesn't sound too frightening, and indeed in itself probably isn't. But it's not just about the rate gain. It's also about the threshold being reduced, and that's where most of the pain is coming from. So that's a big change, national insurance. It is going to cost employers. And when you come back to Tim's point about budget and affordability, this is definitely going to have a marked impact on both of those. Indeed, even Rachel Reeves was forced to admit at the weekend that actually that means businesses now have a choice. It doesn't mean it's a tax on employment. It's not. But it is a tax that employers need to consider how they're going to absorb. Do they pass it on in wage growth? Do they pass it on in lower and higher consumer prices? Do they take lower income returns for the company? These are all choices you'll have to make. But the OBR, who for this purpose are essentially the government's own actuaries, their own forecasters, but also completely independent of the government, suggests that 60% of that increase will be passed on either via higher wage costs or via lower returns for the consumer. So either way, this is not a good place for the UK economy to be, and certainly not for employers. But there is some good news in there. It's kind of hidden. People haven't really paid it a lot of attention. And depending on the size of your company, it may or may not be meaningful. But we have got this improvement to the employment allowance. And I was going to suspect that most people on this call today don't even know what the employment allowance is, but essentially it's a way of mitigating some of these costs. So the allowance has been increased, in fact doubled, I think, to be fair, to up to £10,500. More importantly, the removal of the limit for who can claim this. So there was a 100k eligibility threshold for employers. That's now gone. So pretty much every private sector employer on the call today can now claim the employment allowance. And for the smaller ones, it will make a tangible difference. For the bigger ones, it's probably just a rounding error. But according to the government's own figures, about 50% of employers with the employment allowance won't see any increase to their NI bill. The ones that will are the bigger employers, and I'm guessing that's most of you on the call today. Perhaps more importantly, though, is this one. We were expecting big changes to pensions, and we'll come to that in just one second. And we were also expecting salary sacrifice perhaps to be banned in some way. Well, salary sacrifice is still there, and salary sacrifice is actually even more beneficial as a result of this NI increase than it was before. So if we're looking to mitigate some of this impact, if we're looking to help employers and employees through the mess that we've now inherited, well, salary sacrifice may be something to consider. But I should just point out, and going back to Tim's point around wages increasing, particularly the national living wage and the national minimum wage, don't forget that salary sacrifice cannot reduce someone's pay below those national minimum levels. And the thing that's so often overlooked is where you've got more than one sacrifice scheme in place. So you could end up with an employee with 2 or 3 different sacrifices, which inadvertently drop that person below the national minimum wage or the national living wage. And they, of course, have increased hugely during the course of the 2020s. The national living wage, when you include next year's increase, up by 40% from where it was in 2020. That is a massive shift in a short period of time. And the national minimum wage has gone up by more than half over that period. And actually, the national minimum wage will certainly be increasing by lots more in the years ahead, because the government have already committed to bringing that national minimum wage up to the same as the national living wage by the end of this parliament. So be aware of that minimum base. You cannot reduce someone's salary below that, and be aware that this is becoming quite an expensive part of the employment landscape for many employers. What about pensions? Well, back before the budget, we were thinking there was going to be 1 or 3 changes, or maybe more than 1 and 3 changes. And the 3 changes that were getting widely spoken about, including by myself, I have to say, one was the removal of the tax-free cash sum. I never thought that would happen, and indeed it hasn't, because it would be a disincentive to helping people save for retirement. The second was introducing national insurance on employer pension contributions, which is not the case at the moment and remains not the case. I actually think the industry lobbied, if anything, too hard on this. I think because we lobbied so hard as an industry, it's probably resulted in a bigger impact on national insurance on everything else for employers. So a bit of an own goal, but good for pension savings at least. And the last one, which the government really should have gone for, was the opportunity to finally level pensions tax relief, so that people on high pay and people on low pay get the same amount of incentive to save for their retirement. As it happened, the government did none of those, probably because it has been walking on eggshells during the course of the last few weeks. Instead, they made a fairly cosmetic but quite important in terms of revenue change to how pensions work, which is such that actually pensions will now be included in the inheritance tax calculation. I say will now, but it's not now. It's not now, it's not 2025, it's not 2026. It's from April 2027, we will start including pensions in the inheritance tax calculation on death. What's the detail of that? Well, the detail of that essentially is that IHT will apply to transferable pensions wealth, according to the consultation, by which we're basically talking about anything that hasn't been built into an actual pension income, an annuity, if you like. So that will start capturing more people. That will still increase the take for the revenue, but it doesn't really present employers with a problem. It really doesn't. You know, this is about money coming out at the other end of the retirement process. It's not about the savings process, but it does mean that some of you will need to revisit your higher earner strategy just to help employees through that point. Important point is down here, actually. The vast majority of estates are still not going to be subject to IHT, even with these changes. So just to put that in context, I mean, the right-wing media gets really excited about inheritance tax year after year after year. But up until fairly recently, only 4% of any estates in the UK suffered any inheritance tax. At the moment, we're looking at about a 6% figure. And when this change to pension rules comes in, so that becomes part of the potential inheritance tax landscape, we're looking at about 8 out of every 100 estates finally actually meeting some inheritance tax liability. So still a relatively small, minor point for employers and indeed employees. Another big change will affect you if you've got employee share plans is capital gains tax is going up by significant sums. So the lower rate from 10 to 18, the higher rate from 20 to 24. So if you do have share plans in place, particularly if they're likely to sort of mature in the near future, well, make sure your employees know about this in advance. There's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing they can do about it at this point, but at least make sure that you're clean. They're not going to end up blaming you for not telling them. And again, revisit that higher earner strategy, both for pensions and share plans, because they're the people most likely to have both of those options. What else do we need to look at? Well, I talked about employer costs earlier on, and so did Tim. This is a really stark chart. And when we talk about affordability, this is something I want you to take away from this session because this is quite important. The IFS put out their post-budget briefing, as they always do, the day after the event. And it shows you how this is increasing the cost for employers as a result of these changes. Now, let's take the median figure first. The average increase cost for employment is about 2.5% for a median earner. But look over here, for low paid people. So this is going to really affect transitory workforces that come and go quite a lot. For low paid people, the increase for the employer is about 6 to 7% extra on their employment bill each year. So it is a big cost. It is a big hit for employment, and it's difficult to see how that's going to help the economy grow particularly fast. What about the impact on households of all these changes? Well, everyone is going to be worse off at the end of the 5-year period, but it's the reverse of what we just saw. The higher paid are the worse off, the lowest paid are the least worse off. But nevertheless, this is coming off the back of 4 or 5 very tricky years for employees, and in fact the last 15 years have been difficult for people financially, and therefore we need to be aware that actually people are going to continue to struggle financially going into the future. And I come back to my trustee well-being triangle. If financial well-being is damaged, that will nearly always have a knock-on effect to mental well-being and physical well-being, as indeed the other two sides have a knock-on effect to the other two sides. So the truth of the matter is, we need to be conscious that some of our lowest paid employees and indeed our middle paid employees are going to be struggling over the next few years, just as they have struggled recently, and we need to do what we can to support those in a practical and sensible way. So that's pretty much my final thoughts. I think what we need to accept, this is part of 3 big changes that employers are facing. The budget is probably a once in a parliament type budget. You won't see another one this big, I suspect, during the course of the next 5 years. But it is big, it is significant, and it does present employers with some very serious challenges. Then we had the Employment Rights Bill that I spoke about back in September at the Paydata event. That is huge. A sort of once in a generation change to employee rights in the UK, puts a lot of extra effort onto employers to manage this. And the one that I don't think is out yet is the Equalities, Race and Disparity Bill, which actually deals with things like equal pay and pay gap reporting. Put those 3 things together, and this is looking like a particularly lively and a particularly difficult time for employers. But what I would say about Labour's plan to make work pay, whether you like it or not, and I don't think many employers particularly like it for understandable reasons, I think we just got to accept it's going to happen. To be fair to the government, they done exactly what they said they were going to do. They've introduced the legislation within 100 days of taking power, and they are fast tracking this through. So we know it's going to happen. We know there will be some changes along the way with consultations and everything, but equally we might just as well accept that is the direction of travel. And if you like, learn to love these changes. Whether we do love them or not is incidental. But if we can embrace these changes, if we can make them really happen, then perhaps, just perhaps, they will help improve things like employee engagement, which, as you'll see from this page, is really bad in the UK. We're 33rd out of 38 countries in terms of how engaged our employees are. And if you don't know what engagement is, the simple term I always tend to use is it's the difference between going home at 10 to 5 or going home at 10 past 5. It's going the extra mile for the employer and for their job. And if you look at employee engagement against the old English-speaking world, if you like, we're even further adrift. We're the bottom out of 5 by a distance. So if we can improve employee engagement, and some of these measures I think could do that, then we can also help improve productivity, because the UK's productivity at the moment is woeful. I mean, genuinely woeful, and it has been ever since the financial crisis. And if we are to grow our way out of the challenges of the moment, and when I say we, I do mean every employer in the UK, we need to improve engagement, and engagement will help us improve productivity. We also need the government to step up and do a lot of this for us as well. You know, things like infrastructure, that's down to the government. But nevertheless, we can make big strides towards this as individual employers and do everyone a favour in the process. So my final thoughts on the budget. Firstly, yes, there is a big price tag for this. I mean, it really is going to cost employers a lot of money, but trying to take a sort of glass half full approach, if you like, at least there's not too much extra admin for Reward and HR to do around the budget changes. There's lots of extra admin around employee rights, I know, but not around the budget changes at least. Real big bonus here, pensions and salary sacrifice have basically come through largely unscathed. And that means we have things in place that can help mitigate some of this impact, both for employers and for employees. So we should be looking at that afresh. And finally, financial well-being support continues to remain important. I know it's not the top of the media headlines anymore, but it should still be the top of your headlines as HR and reward people. And high earners may also need to be supported as well. You may need to rethink your strategy in view of the pension changes and the capital gains tax changes as well. So a fair few things to think about, but the cost is the big one, if you like. And I'm going to pass back to Tim.
Thank you so much for that. That was fantastic, Steve. I really enjoyed that, and yeah, really insightful. Some great things there to for us to think about and ponder as well. This is where, if I can get this working now, I want to try and see if I can this is where you have a chance to ask Steve a question via the Q&A part of this. So if you want to type in any questions, and Steve will be, will be happy. Steve and I will be happy to sort of answer them as best we can. And one thing which I mentioned at the outset is that all the slides that you've got here, all Steve's slides and my slides, we'll send out afterwards, obviously, as well. So we've got we've started getting some questions here. We've got Sarah Phillips. Has there been any changes to the NI on BIKs? Do you know what BIK?
Benefits in kind, yeah. Not that I'm aware of. That I don't claim to be an expert on benefits in kind, but not that I'm aware of. So I'll have to pass on it, but certainly nothing I've seen. And I was presenting on a similar subject with a payroll guy last week who didn't mention that either. And he's really, really keen on the detail of payroll. So I'm guessing not, but we'd need to check.
That's great. Thank you. Are death in service benefits provided to employees impacted by inheritance tax changes at all?
Maybe is the honest answer. There's a consultation on this change to pensions being included in inheritance tax, which has just opened. So it opened on the afternoon of the budget and it closes in January. Yes. There's a lot of detail that will come out of that. There'll be a lot of challenges to it. At the moment, if you have a group life assurance scheme called a registered group life assurance scheme, which is what the vast majority of schemes on this call will be, then it will probably count towards the inheritance tax liability in the event of a death. And that's been the case anyway for some years. So there is a potential issue there. There are possible solutions to that, but I don't want to go too far down that line, given the fact this consultation may or may not make that a little clearer going forward.
Okay, thank you. Rue Shoot, thanks for joining, Rue. Asks, there is some discussion about pension reform coming next week, maybe related to the public sector. Have you heard much in the offering about any more details about that, perhaps?
I can't. I mean, the Labour government did genuinely have an opportunity to do some really significant reform here until they kind of lost their way with the changes I mentioned at the start. Because any big change to pensions is going to set up quite a few hackles on people's backs, particularly in the media. And therefore, I'm not convinced there's going to be much radical change to pensions, to be honest, at an employee reward type level for some years to come. I think there was a big opportunity there. They've missed it. I'd much rather they're taking it, because I've been talking about this stuff since George Osborne was going to change everything back in 2016 and didn't. And that wasn't a decision based on policy. That was based on actually the forthcoming EU referendum, believe it or not. That ended it there and then. So I don't think there's going to be any significant change. There will always be tweaks to pensions. There's certainly going to be some improvements to, well, I say improvements, from the employee point of view. There's going to be some improvements to auto enrolment legislation. And we've been waiting on those for quite a long time as well. But I think just assume that for the moment, nothing big is going to happen other than what we've just seen.
Thanks for that, Stephen. Actually, you mentioned around in terms of pensions about annuities. Forgive my ignorance on this. Can you sort of explain a bit about what that is?
So yeah, I think this is where it gets quite difficult. I mean, the slide I threw up, I do apologise for, had all the technical wording about crystallised and uncrystallised benefits, and to most people, including most people on this call today, that means absolutely bugger all. No one really understands it. I think the simple way of trying to say it is anything that hasn't been formally converted into a pension income, and that's what an annuity is. Basically, you save, particularly in defined contribution money purchase schemes, if you prefer, you save this big pot of money. All you're trying to do during your working career is get that pot as big as you can. And all it is a savings fund until such time as you hand it over to an insurer to give you a regular income. So an annuity is when you hand that money over and say, okay, give me an income for my life, whether my life be 1 year or 101 years. It doesn't really matter. It'll be the same level of income. And I think any pension that hasn't been put into an annuity, is probably the simple way to think about it, will be subject to an inheritance tax from 2027.
Okay, no, thanks for explaining that, Steve. I also wanted to ask the question actually about what your thoughts are in terms of this budget. Do you think it will sort of kickstart the economy, kickstart some growth in the economy to help all of us businesses? Do you think that would be a success? And I know that there was, you put up that graph with the line which showed not a huge amount of maybe a slight blip in the first couple of years and then basically the same. But what's your thoughts on it?
I'm struggling to see it, I have to say. I just think if, for the economy to grow, businesses have got to have a lighter touch. And I'm not a big fan of cutting taxes or anything like that, but you can't keep kicking businesses and then expect them to grow, because they've got to grow that much faster to keep up not only with the extra money they've got to pay out, but also with the growth. So I can't see it at the moment. I think it's a good budget in terms of at least setting the ground rules, so everything starts in a better place. What comes after that is probably got to be down to the government to do stuff outside of the budget, and infrastructure will certainly make a big difference. And again, we've not been good on infrastructure in the UK the last few years. I mean, you've only got to look at HS2, which rumbled around for so many years and really will achieve nothing by the end of it, I suspect, other than it's just been a long engineering project. It hasn't really changed the dynamics. We've got to get this stuff right as a country. I don't see this budget as being a good one for growth, no.
Yeah, so I suppose, and people initially be looking at what the costs are, what the numbers look like. But do you think, do you think that the at least what it does provide is now we know that the government sort of set its stall out for the next Parliament, and that stability. I know in September you were talking about sort of look across the world, the sort of instability in other countries, and at least in this country, there's now we've got touch wood a stable political situation, because we've got elected a new government, and now we know a bit. They've set their stall out for the next few years. Do you think business likes stability? So do you think that might encourage maybe that might encourage investment from outside the UK into the UK perhaps?
And I still think it will. I mean, if you look around the world, so let's start with the US, because obviously that's front and center of most of our thinking this week. Yeah. Let's say Trump wins. And this is a personal opinion for which I apologize, folks, but I really hope he doesn't. But let's say Trump wins. he's a bit of a binfire. No one knows what he's going to do. So if you're an investor, would you want to invest in a Trump backed America? Probably not. Let's say Harris wins. Well, Trump's almost certainly going to contest it. So would you want to put your money in there until that's settled? Probably not. If you look around Europe, we've got the rise of the quite far, if not extreme right in some cases, in several countries, including the likes of Hungary. Which is quite concerning. Would you want to invest in those countries at the moment, given that uncertainty? Probably not. You obviously wouldn't want to invest in the Far East because we've got Russia and Korea and China all becoming fairly authoritarian, frankly. So at the moment, the UK is currently, which it hasn't been for a few years post Brexit, but all of a sudden we're a little oasis of calm. Whether we like where we are or not is a different thing, but at least we have a stable government. They're not going to go anywhere for 5 years, and that means there is plenty of potential there. And we are still a massive economy for our size. We're still the sixth biggest economy in the world. Which is astonishing given the size of the country. So, we are an attractive place for investment now that we've settled down a bit post Brexit. And we just got to hope that is what happens. If we get investment and we get more confidence, then things start moving.
It's back to what you were saying about, exactly that. Confidence breeds investment, to that circle you mentioned. No, that's really fascinating, Steve. Now, does anyone have any more questions on the Q&A side at all? You can type your questions in. I'll give you one more quick go, and then if we don't receive any more, we might call it a day there. But no, I don't seem to see any. If anyone, I guess, following today's webinar, if you do have any other questions, you want to email me or Steve direct, but you can if you want to email me, then we can collate those and send those back out again if that's
Absolutely.
the case. So there's just one more thing. We do have another webinar coming up with our own Joe Price, who's actually, perhaps some of this might be connected a little bit with sort of shares and sort of the variable side of pay, and there's been a lot of interest amongst our customers around this, developing bonus and incentive plans and things. So Joe's going to lead something beginning of next month on that, a webinar. So if you've not registered for that, register now. So that's that coming up. That's just leaves me to say thank you so much, Steve, for that. I found it really, really interesting. I hope everyone else has as well. I said we'll send out the slides to everyone else. Have a really good rest of the week, everyone, and I'll see you again soon. So take care, everyone. Thanks a lot then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.